why don't we get started with introductions, Vern? Welcome, everybody. I noticed 30 participants are in here now. I'll just do a quick introduction to the Kootenai and Boundary Farm Advisors, and then we're going to do a rapid fire roundtable introduction that may or may not work, but we're hoping to give Vern a lay of the land, so I might just pick on some people, sort of my own fruition, so he understands what kind of growing is taking place here. So it's my pleasure to introduce Vern Grubinger. Is that how I pronounce your last name? Yeah. Today he's joining us from the University of Vermont to talk about organic tomato production, specifically in high tunnels. And we thank him for joining us today. My name is Rachel. For those of you who don't know me, I coordinate the Kootenai and Boundary Farm Advisor Program. This program is a regional extension program that is funded by 3 regional district areas: the Central Kootenai, Kootenai Boundary, East Kootenai, and Columbia Basin Trust. And we deliver agricultural extension programs in basically the whole southeastern portion of the province of BC. Today, I'm personally joining you from Rossland, as is my colleague Andrew Bennett there, the unceded territories of the Sinixt and Ktunaxa nations. And it's a beautiful, cold, wintry day here, and a perfect time to talk about tomato production in high hoops, where it would be nice and cozy picking off our tomato suckers today. Without further ado, before we hand the reins over to Gurbinger, we're going to do just a roundtable here. So Vern's joining us way from the east. He's very interested to know what kind of production we're doing, how we're growing the tomatoes, and what some of the main challenges are, or questions that you might have to optimize your high hoop tomato production. So I'm going to go across the line here and pick on a few people to introduce yourselves. So Brendan, Parsons, Salix, and Sedge.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. Hi, Vern. Thanks so much for the webinar. I'm super excited to hear you speak. We've got an organic farm in Salmo, and we grow outside, but we also we have about a 4,000 square foot heated greenhouse that we grow mostly tomatoes in, certified organic. And yeah, we've only done that for 2 years so far, but I'm running into nutrition issues. Seems like mostly with potassium, and just trying to keep everything balanced and fed for the full length of the season has been a big challenge. So yeah, I'm just excited to hear your presentation, and I'm sure I'll probably have some more questions. I read your 2012 greenhouse tomato nutrition publication that you put out, Lydia sent to me, so that was super helpful, and I've got some more questions on that when the time comes as well. So yeah, thanks so much.
Great, thanks so much, Brendan. And Matt Carr.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt. I farm at Linden Lane Farms in Cristova. We do 6 acres outdoor production, but we've got 2 heated greenhouses and 11 metal caterpillar tunnel style low or little high tunnels. We grow in the protected culture peppers, long English cukes, tomatoes, and eggplant. I'm really excited about this webinar because I've grown tomatoes hydroponically at the University of Saskatchewan. And with our new greenhouse, we're switching over. It's pretty high tech with roof vents and everything. So I'm pretty excited to move away from kind of a hoop house style tomato production to more of a lean and lower with clipper in our new greenhouse. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Thanks, Matt. And how about Nigel Francis?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I got my son here is
oh, cute.
trying to have a nap. Yeah, so we do a certified organic market garden. We do a CSA mainly, and we supply some restaurants and farmers market. And I have half of a heated tunnel that I have been using for tomato production, but on the verge of giving up on it because I keep having problems every year, and especially with blossom end rot. So yeah, I'll turn it back.
Great, thank you. How about Dale Wilker?
Yeah, hi, Dale Wilker from the East Kootenays, growing in a zone 3 climate. Just started growing tomatoes a couple of years ago in a greenhouse. We do lean and lowering growing in soil, and we practice regenerative farming. So we're trying to figure out how to improve the system.
Awesome.
Thanks
Thank
for doing
you.
this.
Thanks, Dale. And April Anderson. Oh, she was the first one to join our call today. There you go. Oh, we can't hear you for some reason. No. Okay, I'll skip for now and I'll come back and see if we can sort that out. How about Val Rilkoff? I know Val's located in Grand Forks, but maybe she's unable to join. That's totally fine if you don't want to chime in. Emma Sowiak? Emma and Scott? Hi, Emma. Oh, we can't hear you. Oh, okay. Yeah, let's just go. I'm going to pick from outside our region because I see Lydia Rydal joined in, and I asked her about some tomato issues earlier in the season. So,
hey, yeah, we're located in Delta down on the coast, and yeah, we have 4 high tunnels. We lead and lower, grow in the soil. Our biggest issues, we do have fertility issues, potassium being one of them. We're starting to figure that out a little bit, but just some uneven ripening. Also salt buildup in the greenhouses. We grow year round, so we don't have the water flush the salts out. So those are a few issues, but yeah.
fantastic. Thanks, Lydia. And how about Ahmed Ahmed?
Hi, sorry, pulled out of bed. We're in Grand Forks. We grow mostly for a CSA and a farm stand, pretty low tech tomato setup. We have 4 like caterpillar tunnel semi-permanent hoop houses and 2,000 square foot greenhouses. Yeah, we're not great at growing tomatoes. We're okay. So just hoping to learn some stuff.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks so much. Sorry for giving you the bedhead video thing there. You don't have to turn your video on when I pick on you. So I'll leave it there. I feel like I was nasty for going around and picking on people, but I would like to open the floor. Would anybody else like to introduce themselves to Vern, explain what they're growing, and maybe a couple of questions they have for today? No pressure.
While people are thinking of talking, there's also, if you'd like to butt in at any point, down in the bottom corner in reactions, there's a little hand you can push, and then that'll pop you to the top of the list. We'll be able to see you really well if you use that hand.
Great point, Andrew. And I will hand the reins over to Vern here. And I forgot to introduce my team. So today there's me. I introduced myself. Andrew Bennett there, a lot of you guys know him. He's going to be taking control of the recording today and helping me put this all up on YouTube and on our website later on. So thanks, Andrew, for being our tech guy and also our KBFA general advisor. And we have Danny Smart there. You can see her photo up there. She's a new member to the KBFA team as a general advisor. She just started pretty much last week. So we're going to be bringing Danny up to speed. She's based in the East Kootenays. So Andrew and I are in the West, we're in Roslyn, and Danny's over in the East. And so we're happy to have a general advisor join us from the East Kootenay. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Vern. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's great to be with you all. I'm calling in from southeastern Vermont, so a little over 100 miles from the Canadian border. And it's quite cold and snowy here. Our climates aren't all that different. And I've been with Extension for 32 years, working with a great group of growers across the state and regionally. We have quite a lot of organic growers, quite a lot of organically inclined growers, and high tunnels have just exploded here over my career. Probably have, well over, probably close to 2,000 tunnels across the state in various shapes and forms, and the vast majority are growing in the ground, which is different than a lot of the world where people are in some kind of a medium. So I have a lot of slides for you today, about 70. I'm going to go through some of them pretty fast. I will post the slides as just so you can watch the slideshow later, so you don't have to take notes on some of the technical stuff. This is being recorded. Feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go, or just interrupt, and I'm going to go fast enough to leave a whole bunch of time for discussion at the end. And I hope you can all see that. Does that work for you? Rachel, you're muted, but.
I know our catchphrase from 2020
Yes.
stuff. Yes, we can see it. It looks fantastic.
Okay, great.
I'll let you go. And then I'll also put a link to that fact sheet in the chat box.
Yep. So I'm pretty much a generalist when it comes to horticulture, everything from tunnels, nutrient management, post-harvest, marketing, and I have some people that work with me specifically on nutrient management. Becky Madden's one, and I was telling Rachel she's going to be giving a talk, I think, at the end of February to the Organic Growers Conference in British Columbia, along with Bruce Hoskins of Maine, who runs their soil test lab, who we've worked with a lot there, so you might want to catch that. I've put together this website. It's a long link there, but if you just Google Vermont Vegetable and Berry UVM, you'll probably get it, or you can click on this when you get the PDF. And that's sort of my Rolodex of all the fact sheets that I've written, other people's websites. It's organized. There's crop by crop production guides collected from Extension across the country, rules and regulations, marketing budgets, goes on and on. But that's my technical library. And then on the other side, we have the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, which is more interactive. It's got a platform for writing your small scale produce safety plans, for keeping track of your soil health records. And that is open to all members, $60 a year to join. People are welcome from anywhere. And if that's an obstacle, you can pay whatever you can afford. So I just urge people, go ahead and join that. We're having our annual meeting 2 weeks from today via Zoom. It's free and you don't even have to be a member, and you can come and go as you want. About 24 different talks of all kinds of things. So that's my little promotion for what we have going in this corner of the world. I mentioned there's been a proliferation of these structures. This is just one farm. When I started, they had 2 or 3 tunnels. Now they're up to 25. And this ranges all the way from the really old school, small Quonset type with no heat and just irrigation, all the way up to glass greenhouses with lots of technology and automation. And those are more devoted to the ornamental production, but we do have a small handful of tomato growers doing that too. But on average, I think where people have sort of landed now is this, 20 to 24 foot wide, 96 to 144 foot long tunnel with roll up sides, bridge vents or gable vents, heating for the edges of the season, not trying to grow year round, but get started early and keep going a little bit longer. Drip irrigation and a lot of other things that I'll show you now. And of course, so much this is driven by markets. If you just have a peak summer, vacation type of market, there's no reason to push your tomatoes too early. People show up in July, but the local food market has just been expanding across the calendar here over the years, probably in the woods too. So people are trying to have tomatoes earlier and earlier. And also the winter markets have grown for root storage crops in particular, but having leafy greens to help market those is a big plus. And there's a good market for those too. So increasingly these houses are used both for tomatoes and then for winter greens, especially spinach. So I'll talk about that a little bit too. a lot of times we're asked to just focus on the soil fertility aspects of this because it is kind of a black box compared to hydroponics. Soil's so mysterious, but I just like to point out this sort of staves in the barrel approach that it really depends what's the main limiting factors to your quality and quantity of production. And any one of these factors that's ignored is going to limit how well everything else does. So if you have poor ventilation and irrigation, it really doesn't matter if your fertility is dialed in, you're not going to get the response that you could from that fertility. So just stepping back and kind of thinking more broadly about what's going on and where the bottlenecks are in your operation is important. And this is always compounded by the fact that there's so many different systems. So even within the in-ground organic domain, right, you have these sort of 10-month systems on the left there, really large, really lots of root and soil and air volume, fair amount of mechanical inputs from the ventilation, circulation, heating, irrigation, to much simpler systems, the 3-season hay grove, no heat, manual roll-ups, drip, really that's it. And roll up the plastic to keep the snow from taking it down in the winter, start again next year. And then everything in between. And most everybody's in metal hoops now, but we still have some older things with metal. You have people with no mulch, plastic mulch, colored mulch, reflective mulch. So, you have to take everything with a grain of salt as far as does it fit for the system you have and what changes might be appropriate for your farm or not. So just keep that in mind as I go through here. The other twist on this is that different crops are being grown in different tunnels. Obviously from tunnel to tunnel it varies, but even within the tunnel, we have people rotating from doing their starts to then going to tomatoes to then having leafy greens, sometimes all in the same season. We have people with raised beds, people just flat on the ground. So another factor to consider. One principle, obviously, that cuts across this is the less rooting volume you're dealing with the plant, the more both the fertility and the irrigation have to be dialed in because there's so much less buffering. So that is the beauty of in-ground system just in the soil in a tunnel, right? It's really buffered. There's a lot of soil. There's a lot of profile for the roots to explore. Even if the nutrients are a little low, they can go get them if physical conditions good. And the water fluctuations aren't as great as, in a little cell. It's going to dry out quick. If you miss that window of irrigation, you're in trouble. So typically we're taking a field soil of decent quality and turbocharging it. And this is when the light bulb started to go off for me about needing different kinds of soil testing. What you end up with after doing this for a number of years of adding compost, partially aged manure and lots of soil amendments is something that's in between field soil and potting soil. It's not really either. And those were the two tests we had. So to cut to the chase, that's what we recommend is actually using both those kinds of tests to find out different things, even though neither one of them was actually perfect for this, this situation. We do get people that don't have decent field soil to start with, and then you end up with raised beds of some sort or pots or whatever, and you're filling those and sort of making your soils go. But still, that's typically some mixture of soil and organic amendments. And here's a picture of that, whether it was just clay and poor drainage or compaction or whatever the factor in the ground didn't make sense here. So there's lots of ways to build up the sides and make your own soil. And this is a mix of, composted manure, field soil brought in. And of course, the advantage of this raised situation is that it warms up and drains better than being flat on the ground and a little ergonomically friendlier to not have to bend over quite as much. So it isn't just yield, obviously, it's quality, things like yellow shoulder, etc. That are good reasons to want to dial in the nutrients for your tomatoes. And in the potting soil, since most people obviously are doing this from transplants, you want to start with a healthy plant, and typically you only have so much of a nutrient charge in there. And that's the first place you start, is making sure you can grow a healthy transplant by having sufficient nutrition there before you put it into the ground in the tunnel. So we'll talk about testing for that too. And what you don't want to do is get to the point where you're seeing such extreme symptoms where even though if you're correct, you've already kind of set the plant back from its potential. And this is kind of classical potassium deficiency. This chlorosis at the edges of the leaves, a little different from magnesium deficiency, which tends to be the yellowing in between the leaves and the veins stay green. Sometimes they're kind of hard to distinguish and sometimes they're both going on at once. So, visual symptoms are important to look at, but this is where the tests really become helpful, is you can get information before it's gotten this bad and with more clarity because it's actual analysis of the nutrients. And somebody did mention salts. This can be a problem in a couple of different ways. I mean, one is nutrients that we add are salts. So it's not like you want no salts in your mix because that would mean you didn't have the plant nutrients either. But a lot of materials we add, especially sometimes the compost, are high in salts to start with. And if that's the case and they aren't diluted enough somehow, you can cause injury to sensitive plants. And the other thing I'll show pictures of in a minute, right here, is that in the high tunnel, you're having evapotranspiration that brings the salts up to the surface, just like happens outside, except outside there's rain and snow to move them back down. In the desert southwest of the U.S., salts on the surface are a problem. We don't have that in most of the temperate climates, but in the tunnels, this is an ongoing challenge. So a couple things, people talked about water to dilute them, and the simplest way there is just when you need to change your tunnel plastic, take it off and leave it off over the winter and let the snow and spring rains move salts down. Some growers have done things like get their local fire truck to come in and put tens of thousands of gallons into the house. It's hard to add enough water just through irrigation to the systems we have there, whether they're sprinklers or drip, to really move them down. But there's a really pretty simple solution in most houses, which is simply to till the soil up deeply and redistribute these salts back down into the profile because they've been moving up. And I'll show you a slide later from research of UMaine that just shows how high the salts can be in that top inch or two versus even 3 or 4 inches down deeper. The other thing some people have done is once these soils are really built up with lots of compost additions over the years and you don't need a lot of the nutrients that they would be providing, is to move to peat moss for the organic additions and only provide the nutrients that you need. And the peat moss can sort of dilute some of the salt content that you have there as well. An interesting angle on this whole thing is that tomatoes are actually quite salt tolerant as long as you maintain irrigation and don't let the soils dry out, and where the salts would then be kind of pulled towards the plant and cause damage. The real risk is when you go in with leafy greens afterwards, or if you're direct seeding crops in the spring and growing sensitive plants like herbs and stuff. So some of the testing we've done was shocking to me of how well tomatoes did at salt levels that the literature would tell you should be killing them. And as long as there's plenty of water and the salts are mixed through the profile, it's less of a risk than I originally thought. But if you see these white crusts on the soil surface, it's definitely an indication you should take some action. You certainly wouldn't want to direct seed into this situation. So the whole catch to this is we know that it's great to grow in soil and it's got all these wonderful attributes of biological activity and buffering and sort of being more connected to the life cycle than a hydroponic system. The challenge is it's a lot more complicated and a lot harder to measure. Hydroponics, you can completely dial it in. It's totally unbuffered. What you measure is what you get, the nutrient content, the acidity, the alkalinity. There's no biology and there's no, reserve nutrients. And this is the opposite of, it's mysterious. So what I always tell people is, it's not a religion. We're just getting some data. It's like, why wouldn't you want to know? You don't live and breathe by these test results. They're one piece of what informs you. And there's the acknowledgement that there's a lot of things we can't test for, like really understanding what's going on biologically is challenging. But kind of let's use the tools that we have and as a piece of the way that, you integrate information to manage. So I'll spend a little bit of time here on soil testing before we get into other aspects of the tunnel that you can manage. There are three types of tests that we recommend. One is this regular field soil test, like you would do outside. The other is this potting soil test. And the third is tissue analysis or foliar analysis, leaf testing. And they test for different things and they work in different ways. The field soil test uses some kind of a weak acid to extract the nutrients out of the soil to predict what a plant will get over a whole growing season. And one of the challenges here is that there's different kinds of extracts and different labs, especially in different regions of the States and Canada, use these different chemicals to take the nutrients out of the soil. Modified Morgans is what we use around here mostly. Malic 3 is common in the Midwest. There's Braze. You can't compare the results of these extracts. It's like weighing yourself on a metric scale or an English unit scale. You know, pounds are not kilograms. You're going to get a number, but you need to stick with the same analytical method if you're going to compare tests from year to year. And then recommendations are based on these numbers, right? You get a certain amount of phosphorus or potassium from one of these tests, and there's then the interpretation. Well, what does that mean? Should I add more or not? So if you start to mix these tests up, that is a big problem. You have to know which one you're using and stick with it. The potting soil test is more consistent. It's a water extract for what is available now. It's a test for soluble nutrients. And it's kind of like if I put a plant in the ground this afternoon, what would it have to grow? Whereas the field soil test is what will that plant growing to maturity have available? So they're both important pieces of information. The latter is, you know, especially in a high tunnel, right? It's warm, it's moist, you've worked it all up, you're ready to plant. You'd like that transplant to start growing right away. The reserve is for what kind of yield am I going to get down the road? So knowing both is important. And then the tissue analysis is tracking, well, what's the plant actually getting? There's a lot of factors that affect what a root will take up out of the soil. Physical condition like compaction, irrigation, et cetera, et cetera. So put these three things together and you have a monitoring system. And so this is the transplant about to go into the soil, right? It's ready to take up nutrients. This is what you want to know from your saturated media extract test, that potting soil test. What is soluble? What's available now? Later on, this is where the tissue tests come in. I can look at the plant. I might be on the verge of a potassium deficiency. I won't be able to see it visually, but if I took the leaf samples, I would be able to get a sense of that happening. An important point here is that nutrient distribution varies throughout the plant, right? We all have seen that in nitrogen deficiency. The young plants, the young leaves stay green and the old ones are yellow because the plant moves nitrogen up to the growing point. So the results of these are based on a specific part of the plant being sampled every time. So in tomatoes, we're usually taking the first fully matured leaf, which is about the fourth leaf from the top. It's the first one that starts to be at a 90-degree angle from the top. And you take, 10, 15, 20 of these from throughout the tunnel or, from one area. They're different varieties. And that is what the results are used to compare against these optimal ranges. There's different sampling protocols. So the field tests, usually they only need about a cup of soil. You can do it any time of year. The soil's not changing that much. It's good to stick to, spring or winter or fall, largely because you're adding amendments and fertilizers. And if you are sampling, before you did that one year and after you did that another year, it's not comparing apples to apples as much. So just recommend stick to this one time a year. The saturated media is important to do, with enough time before you set the transplants to get the results back. Because this is really why you're doing this, right? Is to know if I put that transplant in the ground, does it have what it needs to grow? Because we're measuring available nitrate in these tests, the saturated media needs to be, warm and moist as if you'd be growing in it, essentially to let the microbes wake up and do some mineralizing of nitrogen so that you get that reading. If it's cold and dry, that won't come through. And then the tissue analysis I mentioned is getting that right leaf. Usually this is done as the plants are about to start setting fruit. Like earlier than that doesn't make sense because all the leaves are needed to grow that plant. And then some people will track this, take tissue tests on like a monthly basis, depending on how long you're going to be harvesting and growing that crop. So you got to take a good sample, and this is representative too, right? If you mix problematic plants that have a foliar issue with healthy plants, you get an average that doesn't mean anything. So same thing, you start to mix too many varieties, it could be dubious what you get back. Then the lab does the analysis. So having the same protocol year in and year out, i.e. using the same lab is important. Then the interpretation, and this is where it gets tricky, right? Unless we did field calibration studies all over the place, here's a result, we add fertilizer, do we get a response in your tunnel or their tunnel or this kind of soil? So basically what I'm saying is there's a bit of guesswork that goes in there. These are estimates. You get a hard number back. You should apply so many kilograms per hectare of this, but there's a lot of wiggle in there. So again, you just have to take it with a grain of salt. And part of this is you keeping your own records over the years and seeing the kind of responses you get when you apply the recommended amounts or something different. There's a fertilizer response curve all the time, right? Your plants need, say, 200 kilograms per hectare of potassium. That first 100 kilograms is where you get the most bang for your buck, right? Wow, there's a big response because they were really in need of that nutrient. Then you get a little bit more for the next quarter. And the last bit is where there's the least return on your investment because the response is starting to level off. You don't want to apply more than that because there's no response to it. And you don't apply too much less because you do start to lose yield, but that's an imperfect, again, it's an estimate. But I tell growers this because if you're short on funds and you're trying to save money, dialing back the recommendations a little bit isn't super dangerous. It's just if you go too far, you're just shooting yourself in the foot because the money would have been well spent on the fertilizer. So I'll pause if there's some questions in the chat before I go on to the scary stuff, which is the actual numbers that you're going to see on your soil test results. Let's see what we have in the chat here.
Yes.
I know Sarah Flood was saying that it's a hot summer and green shoulders were a problem. Solutions to this, how important, and then from April Anderson, how important is water temperature when watering? So I don't know if you want to address those now or after the...
I'll say something quickly and then I have some slides on it. I mean, putting cold water into plants is not helpful. It sort of shocks them. So I'll show you some pictures. Growers are tempering their water temperature before they apply it it's kind of as a best practice. Again, soil that's warm and there's a lot of it and it's buffered, it is going to warm that water up pretty quickly, but all things being equal, you'd rather not put cold water on there. And the yellow shoulder is a bit complicated. It's a couple things. One is potassium deficiency is definitely connected to that syndrome. There's also some other sort of related syndromes, gray wall, and just that whole kind of discoloration of the shoulder, the side. Also potassium connected. When the tomato tissue, the fruit gets too hot, you can actually stop that red pigment from forming. So if you prune too heavily and the sun is beating down on the tomatoes, that's not good. That can also exacerbate it. And then there's a huge varietal factor here that some varieties tend to get yellow shoulder a lot more than others. And then if you want to get really complicated, Ohio State has a whole fact sheet of interaction of magnesium, potassium, and soil texture on this. And that's sort of more complicated than most of our growers are going with. So long story short, you're trying to make sure there's adequate potassium, select varieties that aren't prone to this, and leave enough foliage covering the tomatoes so that they don't overheat. And in some cases, it might even mean shade cloth or whitewash. So let's look at some.
April also asked if there's an ideal water temp.
Oh, I don't know. I'd sort of say, room temp, the same as, the ideal soil. Again, I'm English, so 70, 75 degrees Fahrenheit is what we're trying to keep the soil at, plus or minus. So in a perfect world, the water's the same temperature when it goes on.
Okay, well, I really appreciate this slide that you're showing us right now. I feel like we are ready for the data crunch. I know it's something that we get a lot of questions from growers about how to analyze soil test results. And it's very challenging. So we look forward to your interpretation of how to look at our soil test results.
And this is only partially meant to be silly, you know, numbers, data, it's not everyone's cup of tea. I have growers, they test every field every year, keep all the records, track things. Others, it's much less frequent and important in the way they look at things. But I think familiarity is part of the getting to the comfort of, you know, taking the test, looking at the results, asking questions, and some of the challenges sifting out. There's a lot of numbers there that really they're not actionable. They don't mean much. You know, the labs run the test and you get a number. It's not, there's only a few things I really look at on these tests as far as making recommendations. So I'm going to show you the 3 different kinds of tests, example results here. If I can get to advance, there we go. So this is the regular field soil test in Vermont and most in New England and New York. We use this modified Morgan's extract. So the numbers will be different if you use a different test. And this is kind of what sort of got me into this in the beginning is our high tunnel growers were taking regular field soil tests, and any well-established tunnel, almost all the numbers were off the charts, right? It says you don't need anything, or you have too much, it's excessive. And yet the crops were responding to fertilizer, and the growers, some of them were in the habit of, yeah, I got to feed these crops every year. So why is that? Pop quiz, why do you think that happens? Well, think about it. You get so much more growth in a tunnel, right? Sometimes when you're talking 3, 4, 5 times the biomass of a tomato plant. The people that start really early and grow for 8, 9 months, plants are 20 feet tall. That doesn't happen outside. I mean, and I'll show you some data later. I mean, the yields are literally 5 to 10 times higher in a well-run tunnel versus the field. So these tests, the recommendations are calibrated for outdoor growing. So they're telling you, if you have 15 parts per million of phosphorus and 106 parts per million of potassium here, you either have more than you need or enough. And in the high tunnel, may not be true. Some things are the same, like you see soil organic matter. I don't know if you see my pointer, but 8.3%, that test is going to be the same because it's, you know, they just burn off all the carbon containing material and figure out a percent organic matter. So whether you run the saturated media or the field test, that's a different diagnostic method. So however they get this, it's called loss on ignition soil organic matter. That should be the same. And that's just a good thing to keep an eye on because it affects, you know, how good of a sponge is your soil for holding nutrients. It's totally related to your soil organic matter content. And then some things align with this test and the water extract. We won't get into that, but there are 2 different kinds of tests. I will tell you the space saturation ratio thing, which is kind of baked into the organic approach in a lot of places, is pretty thoroughly debunked in the scientific literature as being useful. It's really all about having sufficiency of the nutrients you need. The ratios are not that actionable or important. The one exception being a little bit, you know, potassium, magnesium, calcium do compete somewhat to get into the plant. So if like one of them's super excessive and another one isn't, it just means it's even more important not to apply more of something you don't need. But it still comes back to the regular soil test recommendation. If one's off the charts, you're not going to get a recommendation for that. It's only going to be for the one that's insufficient. It's no big deal if people get it and look at it. I just push back on like actually managing based on that versus these other numbers that more reflect, do I need more of an individual nutrient? So now we're switching gears. This is the water extract, the saturated media extract, the potting soil tests. So a couple of really important things to point out here that are in that red box. You get some data you don't get from a field soil test. And one of them is that first one, soluble salts. Why doesn't a field soil test give you that number? Pop quiz number 2. Well, I alluded to it earlier, right? It rains, it snows, it's like the salts don't build up outside. So we don't track them. It's not really a concern. Another thing you get are the forms of available nitrogen for plants, nitrate N and ammonium N. You can get an outside field test for that. In the States, we call it the pre-sidedress nitrate test or the June nitrate test. It was really developed mostly for corn growing. When the corn's about 12 inches high, you test and to find out, do I need to add nitrogen fertilizer? And it has been used for vegetables as well. The trick with measuring these available forms of nitrogen is that they're changing all the time because they depend on microbial activity and what the microbes have to eat in your soil. So it's a little bit like asking, what's the temperature of my soil this summer? Well, is it cloudy? Is it not? Has it rained? It's going to go up and down. But again, as a point in time, if you're about to put a tomato transplant in the ground, you would like to see that there's adequate available forms of nitrogen for your plant. And you can see on this one, nitrate N here is 30 parts per million. The desired range is of 100 to 200. So you're either going to have to add something soluble or know that you just put something in the ground, whether it's soybean meal or blood meal or whatever form you're using, that when the soils are warm and moist, the microbes are going to start working on that and release it, and you will soon have nitrate. But that's a pretty low number to expect a plant to start growing vigorously. The ammonium is more of a red flag number because the microbes are always driving all of the nitrogen to the nitrate form. And so if ammonium builds up, it kind of means the microbial cycle is stuck and something's going on. So if being under 10 parts per million is safe, but sometimes we see this when people add a lot of poultry manure, for example, to their tunnels, and it starts to break down. There's lots of ammonium, but the microbes haven't had time to work it all the way. You see this with dried blood being used too. You have to wait. When you first put that in, you get a spike in microbial activity, the ammonium, and if you don't let it go all the way to nitrate, you can have plant injury. So that's just sort of telling you, have some of the materials I've added had time to go through the mineralization cycle. And then these others, the phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, we're just looking at the soluble forms of them. Are they available? This is not telling you what's in reserve. But again, you can see with potassium, in this case, 12 parts per million, we're looking to have 150 to 300 roughly. Like, unless you have something coming for these plants, you're setting yourself up for potassium deficiency. And then most of the minor nutrients I don't really pay attention to, the exception being boron, which in our area can sometimes be low, but you have to be careful with all those. If you add too much, you can get toxicity. So it's safer to just, add more compost or, a volcanic mineral like azomite or something. I'll show some pictures of that later. We don't have many growers actually individually feeding the trace elements. And then finally, this is the tissue test. And there's two samples here just from the same farm for comparison. So you have the GNU house 5 months after transplanting and the greenhouse 2, both from Dutch's farm. And you see the optimal ranges on the right. Something was going on in greenhouse 2. The plants don't look good. Not really sure what it is. So this is kind of a detective tool. Take samples from a house that looks good and same variety and one that doesn't. And lo and behold, look, you can see the nitrogen is below the optimal range and the potassium. And this is where it gets tricky, right? From visual symptoms, when there's multiple deficiencies going on, it's just hard to say for sure what it is. So this really just helped to see, yep, magnesium looks good, phosphorus looks good. Everything is in the optimal range except these two nutrients. Gives you guidance on how to respond. You're gonna have to put some soluble N and K into the system. And typically a grower would use Chilean nitrate and potassium sulfate through the drip to address this when the plants are already established. So that's it for the data slide. You can breathe a sigh of relief. And again, if this is all news to you, just remain calm, take some time, do some tests, ask some questions, and just use this as part of your toolbox to guide what you do. But I alluded to this earlier, right? Look at the size of these plants. Look at the amount of fruit in the long season, really well managed tunnel. This is so much more than we get out in the field. And this was the epiphany we had a few years back. We had one recommendation for various levels of nutrients, and it hit us, wait a minute, it all depends on what your yield target is. And this depends on, are you just a summer grower that you put the plants in May and yank them out in August, or are you starting in February and going to November? Those could be 3 or 4 times different in the amount of yield you get. And field corn growers already do this. When you fill out our soil tests anyway, they ask you, what's your yield goal? Is it 15 tons per acre, 20, 30? And when I say tons per acre, it's like kilograms per hectare, pretty close. So if you're planning for a lot of yield, you've got to plan to put on more nutrients. And of course, it helps to know what your yield goals are. And that's another challenge our growers have. A lot of them really don't know what they're getting. So we can talk about how to figure that out too. There's a link to this fact sheet here. It's a lot to absorb, but this is how we restructured our high tunnel tomato recommendations 2 years ago, was to go to this yield goal approach. And we put some proxies in there so you can see low, medium, good, high yield. That's what the pounds per acre or kilograms per hectare are. That's a lot. So that low yield is already twice what people get in the field. And it equates to about a pound per square foot of area. If you assume a liter on a plant, whether it's a single one or you have a double liter, it has about 4 square feet. That's the yield there. And then we just put in a proxy to try and help people understand, if your plants are only getting 8 feet high, you're not getting 4 pounds per square foot. Like that doesn't happen. You're probably getting 1. So using that plant height as a way to estimate your yield if you don't know. And then we did some calculations, how much nitrogen if you apply, kind of assuming the plant's going to get 90% of it in the tunnel. And this is where we get into, oh my gosh, that's a lot. You have to put on 9 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And then you just get into arithmetic. And we have, I don't have them in here, but we have tables in there of what does that mean if you're using soybean meal at 7% N, or Chilean nitrate at 15% N, or it's just arithmetic to get to, based on the content of my fertilizer, how many pounds of it do I need to get 9 pounds of actual N? And a lot of people do struggle with this just because of math phobia or whatever, but there's people can help you with that. And we do have the charts. So the same thing for potassium, this low yield up to high yield. And here the difference is we're using these field soil tests because we want to know what's in reserve. Those are along the top, and they always have these categories: low, medium, high, excessive, or very high. Once you get to excessive or very high, clearly you can see you don't need to add any more. When you're in these other categories, how much you add depends on your yield goals. So this is a lot to throw at you at once, but it's kind of the intellectual framework for the recommendations. Oh, what's in the soil with nitrogen? We're only giving a little credit for organic matter. You can't really test it's complicated to test how much will be released over the whole season. So we just add some every year and we give a credit for how much will come off from the organic matter. But for phosphorus and potassium, we have these tests for the reserves, and that's the way we use them. And you can see it's a lot. There's a lot of potassium going on and a lot of nitrogen to keep big tomato plants growing healthily for many months. I'll just stop there if there's any questions. I see some coming in the chat. Good question. Can we still use this even if we weren't done with the modified Morgans? The nitrogen you certainly can, because that's field soil test agnostic. It's tricky to convert from these different tests, like from modified Morgans to what Braze is. I think you could do it just sticking to these categories, right? Low, medium, high, excessive. That is probably the most straightforward way to think about it.
Yeah, Vern, there's one about ripening. This one's from April. It's just the relationship between temperature and ripening. That last summer, the tomatoes seemed to start ripening. They went from dark green to yellow, like they were on their way to be ripe. And then the temperature went to 42 degrees for 5 weeks and the ripening totally stopped. We had like an excessive heat wave in the Kootenays last year. And it seems that the tomatoes were well on their way and then the extreme heat just made them stop.
Yeah, I mean, usually, warmth is what helps the tomatoes ripen, but when you get to that level of extreme, other things start happening, just the overall plant stress and humidity, and, stomates are shutting down, like the photosynthesis, the transpiration, water's not moving through the plant. So I don't have a good explanation for why that happened, but we saw the same thing here too. And sort of my general answer, because I'm guessing, is it has to do with stress. That's just way hotter. So doing things like shade cloth. We have a lot of growers going to whitewash paint. There's specialized plastic whitewash paint. Do not just spray any old latex on your plastic. It can, affect its physical quality. But, especially in midsummer, there's plenty of light for the plants. There's more than enough, like reducing some of the light to get the shading and cooling is definitely beneficial. You can buy all different degrees of shade cloth. A lot of our growers go with like 30% shade and just put that on and off on top of your tunnel.
Okay, thanks, Vern. I think it's counterintuitive when you live in a cooler climate to think that there's too much heat, but it actually can be an issue. This question is about balancing soil nutrition, and this is from the first grower you heard from in the introduction. Can we add the full season's nutrition before planting without running into an unbalanced growth? So I guess top loading the soil before you plant.
That's a great question. And the short answer is yes, but it depends somewhat on your soil texture, right? If the soil has the ability to hold some of the nutrients as they're made available by the microbial activity. But we have, most of our organic growers are front loading at this point, and I'll show you a slide on some of it is how do you facilitate the release of the nutrients from these materials. So just to go to this fact that a lot of growers are pulling out their tomatoes and going into winter greens, and we still need more research to understand what soil test results mean and what to apply. Obviously, these crops need a lot less nutrients. They're way tinier and growing a lot slower. So mostly they're living on the residual from the tomato crop. Although, again, an SME is really helpful to see, oh, there's no nitrate there. Might want to add, a small amount, 25 pounds or something like that per 1,000 square feet of nitrogen. So let's talk about some of the fertilizers now. Obviously,
yeah, sorry, Vern, just there was a follow-up question just before we move on. I think Brendan and Nigel were probably typing at the same time because it was another question about applying all the fertilizer in one application of slow release, and then a follow-up sort of like, or does this require fertigation? So I think, as you mentioned, it depends on our soil type and the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients, and that option of fertigation potentially, I guess, if your soil doesn't have the ability to hold on to those nutrients.
Yeah, that, and you want to be able to respond. I mean, doing tissue testing without a fertigation option just means you're going to be hand watering things in or scratching things in and hoping your irrigation moves them. So just need to be thinking about the long-term goal really is to be spoon feeding these plants with the nutrients they need as they grow, whether it's from the release from the soil or from additional applications. And for a lot of growers, it's some mixture, especially when there's like really, so there's a decoupling, right? The soils are slowly, steadily releasing. I'll show you a release curve in a minute. And then the plants, they don't grow at exactly that same curve. Like they take up hardly anything in the beginning. Then, wow, there's this big spurt in growth and fruit set and big uptake. And then they start to plateau again, especially as, light levels decline and the days are shorter and you're not putting on new growth. So that's part of the trick of having these two ways to provide nutrients to the plants.
Okay, thank you.
The caveat that maybe what's allowed under one certification is not allowed under the other. I think generally what I'll show you here is acceptable through most certification systems, but you should always check to make sure so you don't get in trouble. And see if I can get this to go down. There we go. I'm not going to read the whole list. Take home point of this slide is there's a lot of options for all the nutrients organically. Sometimes I hear from people, they don't think they can do this because how would they get such and such? That just isn't the case anymore. And I'm going to show you pictures of these as we go. An important point here is, are you going to apply individual nutrients from one source? Or are you using blends where especially the large nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium? And if you don't need one of those three elements, right, you're applying unnecessary nutrition. And that's where people kind of got in trouble after, 5, 10, 20 years of a tunnel and putting in compost, which is NPK, compost. And then phosphorus in particular is off the charts. So we know we don't need that anymore. And even though tomatoes take up a lot of potassium, sometimes you didn't need it in that ratio to meet the end needs of the crop. And, this is how outdoors we've gotten to excess phosphorus and water pollution, which is now highly regulated in my state and most US states. So we've had organic growers, outdoors have to stop using compost and composted poultry manure and move towards, legumes and straight up end sources, or things like these seed meals, soybean, peanut, canola, which are very high in protein and thus high in N and low in P and K. So, if you don't want to go the Chilean route, that's a good alternative. It does start with getting your soil pH in the right range. If nothing else, this is important because, as you know, from any soil texts you've read, like this frees up, makes other nutrients more available. So be sure and add lime if needed. And then, if you need magnesium, using the high mag lime is the way to go. It's the least expensive way to add magnesium. But if you can't get it and you just have calcite, then you add magnesium from other sources. In some tunnels, we have the pH that's too high. We say like, 6.5 to 7 is kind of where we want to be. 7.1, 7.2, I'm not worried. We get people, especially with on calciferous soils or with very high carbonates in their water, it starts to creep up 7.4, 7.5 and above, and then you should bring down the pH, and that's done by adding elemental sulfur, just like people do for blueberries outside. I mentioned the peat moss earlier. This is also acidifying. So if you're low in organic matter and you have a high pH, then it's really ideal. But also growers have just started to use this. Again, their nutrients are really high. They're only adding nitrogen and maybe some potassium to keep the texture good. People will add peat. It's not really feeding the microbes so much because it's pretty inert, but it is good for the physical condition of the soil. People are using blends, ProGrow, Cheap. They're mixtures of other things like this. One catch here is sometimes there's ingredients that are really insoluble. And even though it says it's 5% N, you may only be getting 2 or 3% of that released over the year. So just have to be thinking about what the ingredients are. I mentioned the blood, which is, straight nitrogen, and just have to give time to move through the mineralization. It's not everybody's cup of tea to be using these animal products. More growers have been using Chilean nitrate, which for a while, that's a long story about the whole certification thing. But again, we don't advise you to lean on this. It is a highly soluble mineral, but it's a good way to address shortages in the short term. Like if you're front loaded, this is kind of what most growers are doing. They're front loading soybean meal, feather meal, canola, whatever it might be. And then if you need to put something through the fertigation, this is what you use because you can get it to dissolve. It doesn't clog up all the emitters, and it's the high concentration of N. And you can see the rate people are putting on there. And you tissue test, and people put this on weekly or biweekly, monitor the plants, tissue test again in some cases. So here are some of the other sources people are using. Soybean meal is one I recommend a lot because it's kind of the least expensive end source after manure. It's going to be GMO if you buy it straight off the shelf. There is organic soybean meal available, but it runs 7 or 8% nitrogen and just a couple percent NNK, so it's a good source. Alfalfa meal people use, but that's really more of a blend. It's pretty low and so really soybean or peanut meal or canola meal or the seed meals of choice in my neck of the woods. And this is the slides I referred to a lot. It's a lot of data to look at, but really the point is this is nitrogen being released from these different things that you mix into the soil. And these were in controlled conditions of certain temperature. The two colors are two different textures of soil, like a clay and a loam. And the take-home message is, look, these things release kind of nicely, slowly and steadily over the growing season. This is like almost 3 months of growing at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And you know that soybean meal in particular is a nice curve for what the plants need. Interestingly, some of those composted chicken manures and sort of more stable materials, the line is much flatter all the way across. There's a low level of continuous release. It doesn't match the kind of bigger release you need when the plants are really starting to grow heavily. And a lot of this has to do with the carbon and nitrogen ratio. You know, the more succulent and available, kind of the lower that ratio is, the easier the microbes can munch it up. Feather meal is kind of hot. It has a really low C to N ratio. It's like 12 or 13%. It's another option if you can get that. And diversity is good, like mixing different things like this. You just giving the microbes option. They can eat different things when the conditions are right. You know, I'm a big fan of that. But still, you need to push a pencil and know how much total N you're putting on. For phosphorus, if you need it, which again, we're finding most of these tunnels after they've had compost and manure for years, rarely need it, but when you're building the soil, you may, and that's when you should use compost to increase nutrient reserves and organic matter. But bone char is a fairly soluble form of phosphorus, or otherwise people would use bone meal. You know, putting on rock phosphate is expensive and it's pretty unavailable. People have moved away from that. And then here's a really important one, because the largest volume of nutrients that we put on is potassium. Tomato plants are like 4% potassium by dry weight. They're about that in nitrogen, but less in the fruits. So they need a lot of potassium, and a big tomato crop, it's crazy how much potassium it will suck out of the soil. The tests are high in the beginning of the year, and then starting next spring, they're way down again. So if you don't need magnesium, we go with potassium sulfate because it's 50% potash. If you do need mag, then people use sulfomag because it's half as much potassium, but you also get the magnesium. And they cost about the same. So there's no point in using sulfomag if you don't need magnesium. Really important point. This research done by UMaine and some others found when you use regular potassium sulfate, as they do in the field, those granules, even though they're technically soluble, they don't dissolve with the amount of water that's being put in a high tunnel. You're not getting big rainfalls like you do outside. So they found some of those granules hanging around 2 years after application. So we're moving everyone to these fines, which are the same ingredient, just crushed up a lot more. It's a material that's made to be put into irrigation systems. So it's going to be a lot easier to dissolve for your fertigation if you're doing that. But even for your front loading, this makes a lot more sense to put in the ground to be released over the season so the plants can actually get it. Just looking at the time here, if you need magnesium and you don't need potassium, then it doesn't make sense to use sulfomag, right? Because it's 22% magnesium. So that's when people just go to the Epsom salts to provide that. If you need calcium and you don't need lime, then gypsum's the option. Doesn't change the pH, calcium sulfate, but it will provide calcium. And then I mentioned the trace elements. People are nervous about it, or they think they might need some. I just push them to something that really can't do damage. If they haven't been applying much compost, that's the place you start, because compost is full of the trace elements that it took to grow the plants that it is made from. And then people do throw on some of these volcanic minerals sometimes, which contain, whatever, 70 minerals. Plants only need 17, so a bunch of them, it's beside the point, but it's a way to get a little, manganese, copper, zinc, all those things. So that was a lot to throw at you about all the nutrients. And I'll pause again for explosions of the brain or comments.
Yeah, well, we had some banter going on just
Okay.
about whether Chilean nitrate is allowable for certified organic growers, and it's not. Matt said that it's prohibited for use in Canada, but I think the takeaway there is that that's a soluble form of available nitrogen, and that there are other forms that we could get in Canada, such as fish or others.
Yep. And there's a lot of, at least down here, organic fertigation materials now on the market. They tend to be pretty expensive compared to Chilean. That's what people haven't done. But hydrolyzed soy is one of the main ingredients, which, you know, has its own questionable origins, but there it is. People did used to use a lot of fish back in the day. It is tricky with irrigation systems. They have to have the filters that won't get clogged and the emitters that won't get clogged. And you definitely want to flush your system to get that stuff out of there so that you don't get microbial growth gunking up the system. But yep, that's another option.
And I saw that Emma Holmes, that's the Ministry of Agriculture's organic specialist, she was on earlier on. She may have had to have run, but if Emma's out there on this call, it would be great to hear from her about what, I don't know, the Ministry of Agriculture can provide in terms of these types of questions, you know, after this call, for example, and what resources they have available. But I didn't see her on the list still, so I can connect her later on in. But if she's out there, I'll get you to chime in later on. And but thank you, Vern. That was, I really appreciated just the run through of different types of fertilizers you're seeing in the States and the difference between sort of more slow release and then the quick available fertilizers.
Sure. So get into some other aspects, nutritional, non-nutritional, of optimizing what's going on in your high tunnels. One thing that totally surprised me when we did some on-farm research and we monitored every bed of 6 beds in a greenhouse tunnel was the almost perfect bell curve we got of nutrient levels. And some of it was, you know, the grower was backing in a manure spreader, unloading the compost every year and backing out. And there's probably some raking going on afterwards, but there were more nutrients getting applied in the middle of that tunnel year in and year out. And even when someone's spreading here by hand, you can just see how irregular it is. So there's that. There's a lot of yield lost in these edge beds. Some of it's nutritional, some of it's temperature. You're getting cold air infiltrating. We're having people using perimeter insulation, you know, blue board, being sunk along the sidewalls. And a big thing is water infiltration. So if it's cold, especially for early season growing, and your tunnel is not raised up enough to keep the cold water from flowing back in underneath, it's going to take the warmth out of that soil. And then just simple TLC, especially in tunnels where the sidewalls are not upright, the smaller Quonset where it starts to curve. It's just a pain to be working in that area, so the plants don't get as much attention. But I emphasize this just because, you know, if you're losing 20% plus or minus yield in those, that, you know, 2 out of 6 of your rows year in and year out, that's significant. And there's ways to address it. This is the salt distribution from some research they did at UMaine, and you can see really high salt levels just in the top 1 inch. You get down to 1 to 2 inches, it's half of that. And then below 2 inches, you're normal. This was a huge, you know, message to me of like, wow, like step 1 is just mix the soil. You can get, and so there is this no-till philosophy, which makes a lot of sense outdoors. I don't know how much sense it makes in a high tunnel, which is already a super disturbed system. Again, almost a potting soil. But, you know, if you never mix these soils, you're pretty much guaranteed to have high salts in the surface if you're fertilizing properly. So it doesn't have to be over the top tillage, but every once in a while, you need to reincorporate those nutrients down deeper. Then there's another sort of question, outdoors versus indoors. I'm super fan of cover crops. Outside, I'm not so sure about their role in tunnels. There's been work on it. There's extension people promoting it. it's good for soil health, but this again, this is such it's such strange soil, right? It's supercharged, it's amended with all this organic matter. The benefits would be different than outdoors. And the big concern I have is pest management, because we know that removing all food for insect pests and removing all habitat is one strategy to limit their survival in the tunnel. And, you know, if you've ever seen this, a really clean tunnel like this, and there's one little green weed over in the corner, and holy cow, it's covered with aphids. Like, that's where they all go. And you realize that's strategies to starve them out, like let them emerge. So there's, you know, the conventional wisdom, freeze your tunnels. Well, yeah, but things are in their dormant stage, they're underground. Maybe it is helpful, but it's not a complete strategy. A big one is make your tunnels warm and moist, warm them up, and have nothing there for the insects that emerge to eat. So this is where, if it's in a cover crop, I'm not as worried if you haven't had aphid problems, but we've seen way more aphid problems since growers started going to the winter green system after tomatoes. When you never have a break in greenery in your tunnel, where it's very short, you're just setting yourself up for a lot more insect problems. And we have a great team at the UVM entomology lab that has kind of pioneered this plant-mediated insect management is another component, of IPM, and that is to have their habitat plants. There's guardian plants. There's a lot of stuff you can read up about this, but the idea is to have hosts for the good guys to multiply that you introduce, to hang out, to survive, and sometimes they attract pests too that the good guys need to eat for their populations to multiply. So these are some of the things people are using as marigolds for thrips indicators, beans for spider mite traps or indicators, and alyssum for sort of some general habitat. And not nearly as many growers are using this as I would have thought, because it's so simple and inexpensive. It is just one more thing to do, but it's something I highly recommend exploring. And I did put in that fact sheet that Rachel sent a link to, like, if you have thrips problems, they've developed a whole strategy for having the biocontrol in the soil linked to the marigolds to attract the thrips and beneficial insects to control them. Speaking of beneficial insects, there's so many, and the tunnel is an ideal place to use them compared to outdoors, both because they can't get away as easily and because you have such high value crops. So bottom left corner is the whitefly parasitoid. Basically, people don't have whitefly problems anymore. This has just become standard practice to buy these Encarsia cards. They're really inexpensive. People put them out preventatively if you've had any problems, and they totally work. Aphids are trickier because it depends which species of aphids you have, but there's a lot of, so even with the Phidias that you see up there, the Colemanni versus the Irvi, we've had some outbreaks of potato aphids because people put in biocontrols that didn't attack those aphids. They were for a different species, and they're tough to identify. So send them off to your diagnostic lab. It's one good step. A lot of people do use ladybugs. They buy them, put them in the refrigerator, dole them out over the season. And then, of course, for hornworm, sometimes you just see these natural controls, the Cotesia, that people will leave those alone, the ones that are infected, and let them multiply naturally. But again, there's some great websites on this, and it's an underutilized strategy to sort of preventatively introduce these things. Especially if you've had certain pest problems, like, don't wait till you really see them around a lot, because that's when the beneficials don't work, because the pests are too far ahead of them. They really work when they're either introduced ahead of time or just at the beginning of the pest populations starting to grow. And this is where scouting and monitoring are so important. Again, simple strategies that aren't used enough just because everyone's so busy. I usually recommend pick someone on your team who's going to be your scout. And one grower told me in my first couple of years here, every Sunday night I go out with a clipboard and I just walk all my crops. And I think that's an awesome approach, is make sure, like, you don't wake up suddenly and, oh, I haven't done a close examination of my tomatoes in a month. That's when you're going to go in and say, holy cow, I've got tons of something, and it's an epidemic, and I'm going to lose crop, or I have to spray something that's undesirable, versus at the bottom is the scouting. Get a little hand lens. It's hard to see things like thrips. They're inexpensive, they're super helpful. And then, the yellow sticky cards, there's a whole strategy for placing, and there's tons of support for identifying what gets stuck on there. And the same thing, you go out, do both these things on a weekly basis. What's on the cards? What am I seeing in the axils of the leaves of the plants? What am I seeing on the, for disease that's starting? And that's the way to manage things, is catch them right when they're starting. We do have more and more growers putting screening on their houses to keep cucumber beetles out if they're tomato growers. And this probably would be helpful for some other insects that move in. The challenge, of course, is it reduces airflow. And so you have to have a really pretty good ventilation system if you're going to do this, or you're going to have hot, sticky air in that tunnel. Powdery mildew is something we had huge problems with a few years ago. I think there's some new, more virulent strains that came in on purchased grafted plants, is what people suspect. And people were kind of casual about this in the beginning, and then it really wiped out some crops. But you can see big varietal differences there. So that's Rebelski on the right. That seems really, really tolerant. Most varieties are pretty susceptible to it. Getting it late isn't such a big deal, but early in the season, it can be a crop killer. Organic growers have used sulfur and horticultural oils, micronized sulfur to battle this, and they're no fun to deal with, but they have some efficacy. One thing we've learned is if you're going to spray with any frequency, those hand pump little things are no fun and not that effective. So people have been, dropping $400 to get a small scale electric sprayer and get the right kind of nozzles. And actually, coverage is key for control of these diseases. If you're not spraying all the leaf surfaces, and 30% is uncovered and gets infected, you've kind of wasted your time and money. And then, we get a lot of just leaf mold, which actually looks horrible and doesn't do much damage. It's ventilation is the key to managing it. So in those older small tunnels, we see it really extreme, and on old heirloom varieties that are very susceptible. So ventilation and variety selection is the only management set of strategies that we're aware of organically. So
actually, Vern, while we're on the topic of disease, we did have a question about blossom end rot. This producer said that I use grafted plants with plastic mulch. I have tried irrigating frequently, up to 8 times a day, and deep watering more infrequently. Same result. Soil tests show plenty of calcium. Any suggestions? Can low potassium play a role?
So calcium deficiency is the cause of blossom end rot, but it's a function of water not moving through the plant, right? That's how calcium, it's a supply chain from the soil into the soil water uptake all the way out. So anything that disrupts that can lead to blossom end rot. Not having enough calcium, which usually is not the problem. Especially if your pH is good, you almost always have enough calcium, unless you're on a super sandy soil. Usually the problem is lack of transpiration. At some point, there's too much humidity and the stomates shut down and the plant is growing, the cells in the fruits are dividing, and there's not calcium moving through the plant. So improving ventilation so that there's more, the air is drier and demanding more water, and the stomate's open and the water flows through. That's usually the main emphasis. Having too much, too much nitrogen fertilization, doing damage to the roots with cultivation to reduce water uptake, that can all be part of it. Not having enough irrigation doesn't sound like your problem, but my wild guess would be you need to improve your ventilation.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting, Vern. We think of putting the water into the soil, and I hadn't thought about it from you need to also take the water out of the environment so that the plant is circulating that water. So Nigel can comment on that more regarding his ventilation, but that's interesting thought, and it speaks well to your next slide. So I'll let you continue.
And the other factor is in early season in heated greenhouses, you know, the strategy is heat up that air early in the morning, open your vents and get it out, even if you have to heat again. Because if you have humid air trapped in that house, even if it's sunny, the stomates are closed and the plants won't grow. So you have to have transpiration for, and stomates open for photosynthesis and plant growth. So it's a little counterintuitive. Like I'm gonna heat my house and vent it, then heat it again. But this is again in the early season when, you know, it's warm, it's sunny outside, cool, and but your house is shut up and it's basically a plastic bag full of water vapor. Plants aren't going to respond to that. And again, it depends how early you start, but different things happen later in the season, like when you have these big canopies. So most of our houses are passively ventilated, which makes a lot of sense to save energy and to get big airflow. But, you know, it's all the physics of warm air being able to rise and move out of the house. So more and more people are going to bigger and bigger roll-up sides that really let air in, especially when you have a big canopy like this blocking airflow. And then ridge vents are the best to like get that, the physics driving the airflow. But absent that, let's see, gable vents, what a lot of people are doing is, you know, it's expensive to put the ridge vent on. A lot of people don't like dealing with changing the plastic. You got to be careful to put it the right way with the prevailing wind so it doesn't get caught and destroyed. You want it to be the wind blowing over it, not into it. But these gable vents are really cool because they're pretty simple. Cut out the biggest hole you can at the peak of your end walls and then figure out a way to make a flap. It can either be a flap that opens the whole thing. Again, have it go to the inside so the wind doesn't catch it and destroy it if it's on the outside. But this butterfly approach is also kind of cool. And people just have pulleys and, you know, cleats, and you open them up manually, and a lot of hot, warm air can vent. Because otherwise, if you think about it, it's a big bubble and everything's stuck up there. And you're trying to get the hottest, most humid air to go out of openings that are down lower. That isn't going to happen. And these big end wall doors too, that's an easy space to open. Like a lot of people have a single human-sized door there. Ideally, it's a double thing that's more tractor size. Whether you go in or not isn't the point. It's just you're trying to make the largest openings you can for airflow. And going back here, what people with these older tunnels are starting to do is put extensions on the ground posts. When you change the plastic, you know, this just takes some structural changing too, and you have to make sure that you have the cross braces and things to keep the structure from getting wiggly, and your ground posts need to be really well anchored to do this, but you can get 3 or 4 more feet of sidewall opening by doing this, and that's really helpful for ventilation. So ventilation is not circulation. This is something people confuse sometimes. Getting the air to exchange out of the house is important, but just moving the air around that's in the house is also important, because you're going to get stratification of temperature, humidity. You know, CO2 gets consumed right near the plant, and you want to keep the air mixing so it's always got an adequate supply. So for any kind of, again, it's easy for me to spend your money and tell you to do all this stuff. If you're just growing for 2 or 3 months and have a simple tunnel and a high summer market, maybe you don't need to do this. But as soon as you start to get to longer growing seasons, these HAF fans, horizontal airflow, are really important. They avoid all those gradients. They do keep the plants a little drier, and you'll see kind of all the leaves are wiggling a little bit. And you're trying to catch the air as it bounces off the corner with this one, so it's closer to the wall. And the last one like pushes it in so it'll bounce back. So the air is just flowing in a big ring all through the tunnel. And there's fact sheets that show you how to lay these things out. There are special fans for this. I see people hang like, you know, box store, cheap box fans up in there. It's a waste of money because they don't move enough air, and they use a lot more electricity. They have different kinds of electric motors. So you can get these from most greenhouse supply houses and Granger and other places. And I don't know what they're $150 or something, but they're going to last a long time. And do the job versus an inexpensive, inadequate household fan. And then we do leaf pruning. So those lower leaves aren't doing much for the plant. I've seen some really extreme pruning and people still get high yields. I think the Quebec growers talk about leaving 10 or 12 leaves on the plant. I guess the main thing, the way I look at it is this is probably a little more aggressive pruning than you'd see in most of our houses. But once those clusters are starting to show any sign of ripening, you don't need leaves below them. You start to at least get rid of those lower ones. You're trying to get the good airflow in there. We did talk about the green shoulder and light exposure. So like if this was a variety prone to green shoulder, these might be at risk now. They're so exposed if you didn't have any shade cloth. So, I probably wouldn't take them off that much, but people find their own comfort layer. And of course, a nice clean cut, snapping them when they're really young on the stem, not leaving stumps that end up hosting botrytis. And if you're going to use knives, you have to be careful not to cut the stem. And it's good to sterilize between plants, but not letting this get ahead of you so that you can not have a lot of biomass that you're removing, that you wasted plant energy to grow, and also less chance of doing injury if the suckers you remove are small. So this is just a matter of really keeping up. And then I heard somebody talk about the clipper system. There's all kinds of hanging systems. The clippers are the ones that have a little sponge that holds the stem and you can raise them up and down. Growers have mixed feelings about that. Some like them, some don't. The clips that you hang on to your strings to hold plants, a lot of people use those. Not really recommended to do the winding thing. It works, but you can do some plant damage. Really important not to reuse the twine over the years. Maybe you'll get away with it, but I've also seen houses where it started to photodegrade and you get a really heavy crop and then they start to let loose. That's a real drag. So you can buy, the twines that are all coiled up, lower them down each year, and then take fresh twine for the next years. I'll stop there too.
Yeah, it seemed like a natural break there. We had a question about bees and pollinators to get fruit sets in high tunnels. Do you have any experience or can you speak to that?
Yeah, great question. It's not in my slides. And growers that start real early and the houses are all sealed up and they have flowering happening, they're bringing in bees and they're buying bumblebees to do that work. And there's a couple of companies people go to. That's kind of standard practice. Once the sides are rolled up and you have good air movement and you have outside pollinators coming in, it's not so necessary. And there's less of that. So it's really about, is the tunnel closed up? Are you growing when it's mostly closed because it's cold or not? But if you don't do that, then you need to have some mechanical way. Everything from people having some kind of system that jiggles the wire that everything hangs from. And then there's manual, in the old day, you've seen those probably little electric pollinators. People go and just vibrate every blossom on a regular basis to get the pollination happening. But anyone with a sizable house, like something like this, there's almost nobody doing that mechanically anymore. They're all bringing in bees if they're growing, if they're having flowering when the house is closed, which would mean, they're setting plants in this area, probably in the ground in, February, March, something like that.
Okay, thanks, Vern. Yeah, so it's very timing of the year specific because the pollinators start to zoom about by, I guess, early spring, probably here around early May. So if you're having flowering before then, releasing pollinators is a good idea.
We have a couple more questions that are linked to the sanitation. Lydia asked about other sanitation issues, say landscape cloth on the ground, reusing that, reusing hooks.
Yeah, it's hard to get too compulsive about, sanitizing a highly biologically alive growing system. Things that are easy to use, like your hooks and your clips, you put them in a bucket of 10% bleach or oxidate or something, kind of why not? There might be, and usually the things on those are, well, it's also what your disease history is, right? So we have things that are, they're everywhere, but they're not that aggressive. So like gray mold, botrytis, right? When you have dead tissue, you're going to get that. Not having dead tissue, having good ventilation, you don't see that become a big problem. But if you've had things, yeah, like sclerotinia, which is white mold, you know, more aggressive diseases that can overwinter, certainly bacterial canker, and you start to get more paranoid about what has, you know, to the point where if I had a lot of bacterial canker, I'd probably throw all the hooks out. Just not worth saving $50 to have that happen again. So that's the lens that you're looking at. This is like, what is the risk? So yeah, I've just had these run-of-the-mill non-aggressive diseases. I'd like to clean things up to keep them from getting worse. So sanitize what is easily cleaned, certainly washing things off, you know, stakes and stuff. But yeah, the fabric on the soil, you know, get the residues off, but it doesn't make any sense to actually try and sanitize that.
Okay, thank you, Vern. We had a question about nutrient balancing from Heather Fenstra. And this speaks to the fact that a lot of our soils in the Kootenays are actually boron deficient, and asking, can inadequate boron disrupt calcium uptake?
I don't know. You know, it's more fruit formation, and certainly in tree fruits and small fruits, boron is, you know, applied regularly. And in my neck of the woods, we do it for all the crucifers and beets, and, you know, the standard practice is like 1 pound or 2 of actual boron per acre. Because boron can also be toxic to plants, and because different families of plants have different sensitivities. So like if you were going in with cucumbers after tomatoes, and cucurbits are highly sensitive to boron, there's a narrow window there for the right amount before, you know, it's good for one crop and bad for the next. So I would defer to your local experts on an actual recommendation. But yeah, all plants need boron. So if you are that low that it's affecting tomato fruit development, I'd be concerned. And that's where I come from, rather than it affecting another nutrient. I don't have clarity about how that would happen.
Yeah, interesting. And it sounds like Heather might be questioning her plant's ability to uptake calcium and is trying to troubleshoot that. Same with Nigel. And maybe it's a ventilation issue. Maybe it's inadequate supply, but good question, Heather, trying to understand what nutrients could be blocking other nutrients. So,
and calcium and boron deficiencies, you know, I think their role in the plant is somewhat similar. Like you tend to see cell breakdown, like a hollow heart kind of things, and other kinds, like in some of, you know, cauliflower and broccoli heads, and bad fruit deformations in small fruits, and I think in tomatoes too. But I'm not familiar with it. We don't tend to get boron deficiency that I'm aware of here in tomatoes.
Okay, thanks, Vern. And
We
Vern,
have,
I think sorry, I think
do we have time for another question, Rachel?
yeah, well, I was going to read Brendan's response about
Yes.
pollinators because I thought it was kind of interesting. Is that what you were going to read?
I was going to Matt's question on tobacco, so you get them all.
Okay, so I'll read it out to Vern because it's interesting based on what Vern said. This was the first grower who introduced themselves. It says, we use bumblebees in the spring from Coppert suppliers in our greenhouse. One thing we learned this year is to make sure there's enough flowers to keep them busy and happy with enough pollen, or else they'll start chewing your plants.
Absolutely.
To make them flower quicker. Can also feed pollen if these bees show up too early.
Yeah, they will chew the blossoms. If the ratio of bees to the blossoms there is not adequate, they can do damage.
Okay.
Very good point.
And sorry, Andrew, I'll let you read the next one.
Sure. So Matt's got the question about employees who use tobacco. Have you seen any problems with that situation in low tech organic systems bringing in TMV?
You know, that's something I've read about for my entire career. I can't say I've actually seen it, but what's the downside from not allowing smokers? It's like, you know, it's a lot of our growers do enforce that, just erring on the side of caution, but it's not like a rampant, like, oh, I've seen that so many times, really shouldn't do it. For me, it's really just out of the literature.
And that's-
The viruses that we've seen have more come from commingling of ornamentals and tomatoes. So what is it? The dwarf mosaic, and it's escaping me now. A few years back, we had some big problems with, so as a general principle, it's a good idea to just stick to tomatoes in there. We have people who put their hanging baskets in early in the season, created from, starts they brought in from bigger commercial growers, and you're kind of looking for trouble. If you do that, it doesn't happen all the time, but not a best practice.
Thanks, Vern. I should have mentioned TMV, tobacco mosaic virus.
Yeah. No, I get that one, but it's the other one I'm trying to remember that comes
Just
in.
for anybody who didn't know on the,
Okay.
on the call.
And we do see viruses on tomatoes, a lot of them I think are seed-borne when we see them. And then we see physiological leaf roll, a lot of just the leaves curling and cupping, which is sort of a varietal thing and not a big deal, but it can be concerning. Then we sometimes see ethylene damage that looks like virus, stringy leaves, blossoms aborting, and that is when there's a problem with the heater. There's a cracked heat exchanger, or the combustion exhaust is getting blown back into the house. The stack isn't high enough. So heater servicing is really important, or you're heating with a wood stove. You can get into trouble with that.
I think
All
that's
right.
all the questions for now.
Okay, I don't have too many more here. We'll blunder through the last part. Just briefly show you some of our growers are getting into steaming. Started bringing in old tobacco steamers from Ontario, and then now there's people that grow a lot of winter greens and have heavy duty chickweed problems are the ones that are really into this, because like the chickweed is overwhelming in the winter spinach if it's out not managed, and it just thrives in that environment, and the steaming really works to control it. And my colleague Becky Madden's been doing research on this, studying whether the microbes rebound and to what extent. Sort of short answer is they seem to. There's a lot to be learned about this, but you can just see how it works. It's a big boiler. It uses a fair amount of fossil fuel when you use it to make the steam. It's distributed in this sock, and there's even, a lot of discussion, what's the right kind of sock? There's different materials out there, the holes, the distribution, but you put some kind of tarp that's weighted with chains or sandbags or something else, and you basically heat up that soil to 160, 180 degrees. You're only really trying to get the surface where the chickweed seeds are, and it totally works to control chickweed. So we have a bunch of growers who are sold on this, others who are skeptical about the fuel use, of the effect on microbiology, and I think, as I say, it all comes down to, if chickweed is killing your winter greens production, you probably want to look into this. Otherwise, I don't have a strong recommendation for it. And grafting, I mentioned earlier, this has become standard practice for, I would say, the majority of our serious tomato growers at this point. They don't all do the grafting. We have some growers for whom this has become a business. We do have people buying them in from away, which has its pros and cons, less expensive. But again, we think some diseases came in this way. Originally, people were all doing the side graft, which is sort of easier to have success with. You make a wedge, and this is essentially like what's been going on with apples forever, right? You have a shoot that you want the fruit characteristics of, and then you want a more vigorous root system. So with the side graft, I won't get into the whole thing, but top grafts is mostly where people are at now. We literally cut off the top of the plant to get the root system you want and the top that you want, and the timing is important. You're seeding both of these. They don't all grow at the same speed, so there's some staggered planting to make sure that you have the right match of the diameter of the stem. They have to be the same size, and they have to be the same age and pretty young. And then there's a lot of clips, a lot of equipment that's come out of Japan, Asia, Southeast Asia. They've been grafting vegetables for a long time, not just greenhouse, the field too, to overcome diseases. But if everything's going great, your soil's really healthy, you don't have diseases, you're not going to see a huge benefit from this. But we have growers where there's a lot of root disease after years of growing. It doesn't kill the plants, but you pull up those roots and you see they're kind of brown and gnarly, partway into the season, and you just get a much more aggressive, large root system that contends with diseases and other things too. So tons of our growers swear by this, and that's what they grow now, is grafted plants. And there's different vigors of rootstocks, Maxifort, Beaufort, Estamino. You can get into all that. University of Arizona has a great grafting website. There's videos from North Carolina too, and it's just something to consider, especially for longer season production. If you're starting to see, declines in yields, and especially if you pull up roots and they don't look healthy. And if you do this yourself, a big part of the success is the healing after grafting and having them in the right conditions of just enough humidity to allow them. Here you're trying to like shut the stomates, let them heal. You don't want them trying to grow and not having them rot. So it's sort of a simple method is like under the bench with a plastic sheet, lightly misting for a few days and then take them out. But I'm grossly simplifying because, people either figure this out or they don't. And you hear this all the time. I'm losing half my plants. It's terrible. And then they get somebody on their staff. It's like 95% success rate. Suddenly that person's worth their weight in gold for grafting. Here's some pictures of the thermal adjustment for irrigation water. That question came up earlier. So people using plastic tanks with heaters in them. Oh, I don't have a picture of it, but also there's heat exchangers. If you have a hot water boiler, that you can actually have a little exchanger that goes on your water line and just warms the water as it's passing through. Obviously, if you're not heating at the same time, it doesn't work, but it's pretty swift. And this is something else we learned from our multi-state collaboration when we surveyed like 20 different in-the-ground tomato production farms, and just like, whoa, some people have 1 line per bed, some people have 4 lines per bed. What's going on? And we just started looking more at the farms and realizing, depending on the texture of your soil, so if you have a lot of clay, organic matter, the water will move sideways a lot easier through capillary action. As it gets lighter texture and sandier, it tends to go straight down. You probably all know this from your field irrigation, but even here you can see, if your lines are too widely spaced, there's a dry area in between. The roots don't grow there. It doesn't matter how many nutrients you apply, the plant's not going to get them. So we've had a bunch of growers after that study suddenly double up and using 3-4 drip lines per bed now, just to make sure. We're not saying put on more water necessarily, but distribute it more evenly across. And so this is a really low cost fix to something that could be resulting in your plants not getting half of the fertilizer you put on. And this is back to even to the blossom end rot thing, right? Is, having all the roots, having a more robust root system completely distributed across the area to be able to take up water and calcium and move it through the plant could be helpful. Plastic mulch, no plastic mulch, it depends, right? If, so one thing we know, it's warm and more oxygenated near the surface. So, and there's a lot of nutrients there. So helping our roots grow there is good. Plastic mulch does that. And a lot of people don't like to use plastic. That's cool too. Putting organic mulches on here also helps it stay moist and the roots there, but it keeps the soil cooler. It insulates it from the heat in the air. So that's okay kind of later in the season. The soil's already warm, but if the soil's not warm and you put straw or hay on it, you're going to keep it from warming. So that's not good. So there's no right answer for this. It's just thinking about what you're trying to accomplish here. Certainly for weed control, not doing anything is problematic if you have a lot of weed seeds. And so most people are mulching with something. We have people doing landscape fabric too, just covering the whole house, popping some holes in for tomatoes. So, whatever works for you. It depends on the factors in your tunnel. And early in the season, we do have people using the white on black mulch, just trying to reflect more light up to the plants when light is a limiting factor for growth. As you go later in the season, it doesn't matter. There's plenty of light, but one more little aid you can give your plants. Here you see our grower, Krista Alexander from Jericho Settlers Farm. They're really good tunnel growers. And you can see they've morphed from those little tunnels everyone used to put up. Now I think everything they build are these, I don't know, what are they? 40, 30, 30, 32s by 144s, like putting up really big tunnels with. So one thing is you have a big root volume, big soil volume, you have a big air volume. It's all buffered against change, right? The temperature's not swinging as much as it does in a small house. You've got a lot of reserve of nutrients and water in that soil. And anyway, that's an aside. And look at the size of those roll-up sides, how much ventilation you can get when those are lifted all the way up. But here she's using a penetrometer to test for compaction. So just like in the field, we've found a lot of agricultural soils that have been worked over the years. There's a layer through which roots don't want to grow. And it usually tends to be 10 inches down or so, plus or minus how deep things were plowed and disc forever. So if you're going into an old ag field, that might be there. This is a tool. It's just a stick with a pressure meter on it to tell you how hard it is to push through. And you probably can get one from some soil science support person. They cost a few $100s, but we use them a lot to just test, is there a layer there? And does it mean that you should subsoil the tunnel before you plant into it or build raised beds or something? It's letting you know how much of that soil your plant roots can actually explore.
What was the name of this farm, Vern?
This is Jericho Settlers Farm in north central Vermont.
Great.
And then, well, two things here. One is just there's so many tools for remote monitoring now. So if you're growing when you can have temperature extremes, especially cold, these thermal alarms are crucial to have to let you know, hey, the heater broke, or I ran out of propane, or the natural gas is out, whatever it is. And they used to all be hardwired. Now you can get it any way you want, going to your phone, Wi-Fi alert to your computer, smartphone, or simply just an alarm that actually goes off and you hear it. So this has saved growers, hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. And I've seen houses completely fried. It goes the other way too, of like, whoa, somebody left that was supposed to roll up the sides and it got sunny and hit 90 degrees and everything got cooked because nobody got notified. So that's the simplest level. Now it's up to, man, we have a young man started a company here, a smart farm that sells all these monitoring, and he will help you set up. Hopefully you have somebody like that up there. I would think with all the greenhouses you have, you would, but I mean, everything from the propane tank levels to whether a door is left open, humidity, soil temp, air temp, pump, irrigation water pressure. There's so many things that you can have an eye on just with your phone to know what's going on. Again, it's easy for me to spend your money and say, get all these things, but what's important to you? And certainly knowing that your house isn't freezing or cooking is the first step. Then you're going to run your heaters based on some thermostatically controlled device. A lot of people have these old crappy mechanical heaters that are like off by 5 degrees from what they actually read. So the next step up is just a good mechanical thermostat before you actually get to controllers, electronic controllers. So Dram is a good brand. They're like $100 plus or minus, which just means your heater will operate when you actually need it to, rather than a really sloppy control. We have a lot of houses that have had collapses over the years. Some of it is if your door latches aren't strong enough and they blow open on the wind and the wind gets in there, it's going to make it into a giant sailboat and rip the plastic off. Having these seals, so there's pieces of plastic along the bottom and at the corners so that the roll-up sides seal tight, both conserves heat and keeps the wind from getting in and catching. So now I'm going to get to the meat of the matter of some tomato yields, and then I'll be done. So this was some data from 16 different farms we worked with a few years ago in the New England region. And you can see the yield on the left goes from 5 pounds per square feet down to about 1.5 pounds on the right. And the little PM boxes are tunnels that were affected by powdery mildew and lost a lot of yield. So again, this was just an eye opener to say, whoa, there's a huge range of what people are getting there. Some of those people down in the 1.5 pound, like that fits their system. Their plants are 8 feet tall. They go in late, they come out early, they have a summer market, they're good. But if that's the same system as over on the ones on the left, like designed to yield 4 or 5 pounds and they're getting 1.5, that's when you have to start, you're asking yourself, what am I missing? What has to be improved? So the two pieces are is, what can I reasonably expect from this system? And a lot of that is how long you grow, whether you have heating systems, whether your irrigation, nutrition, pest control, all that's dialed in. And if it isn't, what can you fix? So this was just an eye opener to some people, like, whoa, some of my peers are getting 5 pounds per square foot. I'm getting 2. I need to up my game. And it does start with, measuring something. One thing we urge people is just like, if you harvest into boxes, you know what a box weighs, have a clipboard and count the number of boxes that come out of your tunnel. And then you know the square feet and you can get to it. Like, you don't need to weigh every single fruit, or you do a subsample of one plant that you might, but if you have no idea what you're getting, there's no way to know if you make improvements except kind of intuitive guesses on observation, which can be deceiving. So there's the greenhouse yield range that you kind of read about, and a small portion of our growers are actually in that range. And then you can see, though, everyone's above the field range. So it certainly makes sense to have the high tunnel, even when things aren't totally going the way they might. You're still going to get, yield increases, and the payback is there. It's just there a lot faster if you get a higher yield. So here's where it also started to get interesting. There's the same yellow yield bars I just showed you, now with plant density. So the lower bars have higher plant density, right? So the one all the way to the left, that blue bar, they're at 4 square foot per stem. The reason I say not plants, some people, when they graft, they will have 2 liters. So there's 2 stems on a plant, but 8 square feet total. So 4 square feet is kind of a standard recommendation, and people get good yields. Some are a little lower. You see, the farm next to it is like at 3.5 feet. And there's some correlation here, right? As the blue bars go up and you're having more space between the plants, the yields start to go down. It really makes sense. You just packing things in, and it's the same whether you're doing winter greens and leafy spinach too. You put more spinach plants in there. At some point, there's no return because the plants would have filled in pretty quickly. But when there's big gaps between the plants, you're going to get less yield. The challenge, of course, is when you pack things in, you tend to get more disease. There's less air movement. And so that's where I'm just cautious. Yeah, think about having higher density plantings, but if you don't have good ventilation, it's probably not a good idea. You want that air to be able to move through the plants and the leaves to dry off. So, but we did have a lot of growers up their density after seeing this, of like, hey, I've got a big tunnel with ridge vents and roll up sides, and I was at 5 square feet. They went down and they saw a response in yield. There's also the factor of varieties and humidity. So you can see the 2 different cherry tomatoes. The one on the right does not have all the funkiness, and the one on the left is suffering from the high humidity and having more disease. So you've got to calculate all of these factors when you make your decision about plant density. We have a lot of different planting dates, people setting them in the ground from the latter half of March all the way to the early May. Markets are driving a lot of these. Just one point is, we've seen, if you don't have ground heat and you put in these plants really early, they pretty much just sit there. Like, it's really hard to heat up the soil, even when you have an air heating system. The advantage of early planting is really much more evident when you heat the ground too. And so we have a lot of growers that have these simple ground heating systems, domestic hot water with, loops of tubing that go through the house. And you can see these designs online of how to do that. So, as temperature's lost, like, you don't want the end of the loop to be really cold because all the heat's been lost. So there's a way to lay this out so that the temperature, which is going to be, 100, 120 in that Fahrenheit in that tube, that's 8, 10, 12 inches down, so that you're trying to get the soil to 75 degrees or so to let the plants grow. And again, this is only worth it if you're, like, pick some number where the soil's cold for a month, or like if you're if it's only happens for a week or two and then everything's warm because it's sunny, the days are long, the payback's not there. So just some quick pictures of what these houses look like with a high yield. So this was the highest yielding house I think we've ever measured, getting almost 7 pounds per square foot. They didn't even plant that early. You can see, so this probably went in second half, the middle of May. And you can see the raised beds prepped there, the complete mulching system. And you can just see how well the plants grow and how big they get and what good condition they're in even into September. You can see there's a ridge vent on this house. And then they're starting to go down by November, but that's a really long season. And here's a shorter season, much more widely spaced. They have disease issues. They get lower yields. Again, still not terrible. It's at least twice what you get outside, maybe more. And quality, that's a whole other thing we didn't mention. Obviously, so many people have moved away from field production just because of the diseases that get on the fruit when we get all of the summer rains. So there's the summary slides. I'm not going to read all this to you. It's the things that I talked about, but putting all these things together is the way to optimize your nocturnal tomato production. And
Do
look
we
at
have time
that.
for questions, Rachel?
Yeah, this has been fantastic, Vern, and it's great that we'll have these slides after to share with everybody. And the questions have been pouring in. So I'll read the first two and then I'll swap off to Andrew to read. So I'll read from Janine and Brendan. I'll start with Brendan, and this is about soil testing. Vern mentioned doing the SME test when soil was warm to give a better representation of the mineralizable N. If sampling can't be done when the soil is warm, is the SME still accurate for providing the level of the other nutrients like potassium and phosphorus? And just to clarify, the SME, that was the
It's a saturated
soil
media extract test. Sometimes it's just called a potting soil test.
Yeah.
But SME is kind of standard, and that's a great question. And the answer is it's really just nitrogen that depends on microbial activity to get into its available forms. I often recommend to growers take the soil sample, moisten it, and bring it into your house. Let it warm up there. Like, you don't have to heat up the whole tunnel just to do the soil test. And again, if you just have air heat, it's going to be really hard to warm the soil anyway. So, and it's tricky, right? Microbes are all over the place of how active they are. Exactly what that temperature and moisture is. It's just, if it's cold and dry, there's not going to be anything there. So unless, you were saturated from the years before fertilization.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. The next question is about it's from Janine at Earthy Organics. Do you recommend giving the tomato house a break from tomatoes? For example, every 3 years, grow something else.
Another excellent question. Crop rotation is a tried and true principle. Agronomically, there's no downside from taking a rest, right? There's only upside of less disease inoculum. Pests that prefer tomatoes or specialize in tomatoes will dwindle in number. That said, most tomato tunnels are set up for growing tomatoes. And that's where the market is, right? People grow cucumbers and peppers and other things, but those things are dwarfed by the demand for greenhouse tomatoes, and it's to my neighborhood. So it's really hard to say just stop. If you're in trouble, like, just stopping is good. So I kind of just live with people, the rotation is stopping tomatoes for part of the year, but not stopping for a whole year. That's just the way people grow. And we've had people get into trouble, especially you start to get, sclerotinia, canker, some serious diseases, certain thrips versus others never had it. And, the joke I always say is, well, some people don't floss their teeth and they don't fall out. Other people, they do. So ideally you have a good rotation in the season where there's a long break from tomatoes in a given year. That's kind of a minimum. And the people that go really long, like are 10 months in there and have a really short break, they're just at higher risk. So there's no right answer, but the longer you can stay out, the more upside there is.
Great, thank you. I'll let you go, Andrew.
Sure. A question from April. Is there an impact on tomato quality, nutrient or production from having sunlight go through the plastic? Is there a benefit to having direct sunlight?
You mean like taking the plastic off?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Yeah. Is there any impact?
Not to my knowledge, possibly negative, because you're blocking UV light, which with those plastics, although there is bee-friendly plastic. That's another thing I should have mentioned. If you're bringing in the bees, allowing some of the UV light through lets the bees locate the flowers better. So they're formulated that way. But and just in practical terms, there's like, you don't want to be messing with taking that plastic on and off, because you're gonna start to rip it up with removing wiggle wire and things like that. So people mostly just leave it alone.
Just leave it alone. April clarifies she's just rolling up the sides to get that direct light. But if you're saying there's no impact, then maybe really it's just for ventilation.
It's really for the air. I mean, I might be missing something, but that's why people do it.
Is there an optimum air temperature?
Yeah, well, this gets into like how sophisticated you want to be. Obviously, if you start to get too hot, a lot of bad things happens, but especially, pollination doesn't occur above, I don't know, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. And do you have the photosynthase to, if you have a lot, like, you're going to speed up the plant metabolism with higher temperature, right? If they can't be if they haven't been photosynthesizing, they're going to burn up their own reserves to sort of function. So, the really sophisticated growers in Holland and Quebec, they're adjusting temperature based on how many joules of sunlight have arrived in the previous 24 hours. So they can take that energy that the plant has and, turn it into fruit. And this is way more sophisticated than our growers. So we're basically shooting to use, to heat, like, you don't want it, you're going to get chilling injury if things start to go below 50 degrees or something Fahrenheit. So, but we're trying to probably maintain, 60 to 65 at night and 75, 80 in the day. And again, some of that is, if you're heating, you might not go that high. If you're cooling, sometimes it gets higher because you can't ventilate enough. That's sort of the general target. And we do see a bunch of chilling injury every year early in the season, where especially plants along the edges of the tunnels, you see this kind of white dead tissue in the leaves, and people think they have diseases, but it's just chilling injury.
Thanks, Vern. Maybe one more, Rachel, or do we have time?
Yep, sounds great. I saw one from Sharon. It was sort of above. It was, I remember
microbiological activity. What conditions in the environment of the tunnel can improve your microbiome?
I assume you're talking about in the soil.
Sure, but that's a good point too.
Well, one thing is, there's a lot of biological, there's a lot of good guys you can put on for disease control these days. And that's what's interesting. We have a lot of people using trichoderma, which is like T22, and then plant shield, root shield. So it's a beneficial fungi you inoculate your soil with. It's kind of standard operating practice for a lot of people doing bedding plants. Just mix that into your potting soil and it grows with the roots. And it's a good guy that kind of competes with the bad guys. And then you get into, there's a long list of, bacillus products and glyocladium, and we have some growers, they just make up these kind of poo-poo platters of good guys and throw it in. It's low cost. It's a small volume of soil. It's not that expensive. They're not toxic. Why not? Is there a lot of research data to support exactly what to do and when they work? No, because you have a handful of trials and it's hard to extrapolate from that, but it's kind of a best practice. As far as the soil itself, this is what's so interesting. There's so much energy and interest around soil biological activity, but yet the soil is totally alive. It's like got millions and billions of organisms in every heaping teaspoonful. And even when you kill them off, they repopulate from nearby soils and come back. So it's hard to know exactly what we're trying to achieve and how you measure, you can have total soil respiration, like how much CO2 is coming off. Well, that's one measure. There are people starting to plate out what are the different categories of, the different categories of fungi, or just even fungi, bacteria, but exactly what should you have? That's the part I don't know. My philosophy is these soil microbes require digestible forms of carbon to survive, and that's what they eat. And adding that to your soil is good. And certainly outdoors, like fresh green cover crops, that's the simplest way to like feed your soil life. In the tunnel, it gets trickier because again, it's like, do you need to feed a potting soil? I don't know for sure, but having organic amendments certainly early on in the building phases is important for the physical structure of your soil, and you're going to feed the biology too. And then even after that, there's just tons of stuff there, the old roots and the this and the that. But as far as like specific guidance, you should add this to get that. As far as microbiology, I feel like we're like in first grade, if that, even really figuring out, even though people have a passion for it because it just is so appealing and sort of makes sense. But there's a lot of, I don't know, sometimes practices being promoted that I just sort of left with maybe. I'd like to show them what are the criteria and what's the evidence. And I feel like the stodgy old extension guy sometimes saying that, but like, I'm not going to tell people to do things and spend money and time on stuff when I just don't know if it works.
There is another question on whether it works following up on the heat. Last summer, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but BC experienced a heat wave that was somewhat unprecedented and really a lot of problems across farming sectors. When dealing with extreme summer heat, is there a benefit in a tunnel to misting?
Well, evaporative cooling is a real thing, right? When water evaporates off surfaces, it cools. So as long as you aren't elevating the humidity in your tunnel for a long period of time, that could be helpful. I'd probably start with the shade cloth and the whitewash as just a more stable way of like, you don't have to figure out going in there and misting all the time and keeping up with it. And at some point, if it's that hot, that long, it's a lot of water to keep putting on. But yeah, putting water on and having it evaporate and then be dry definitely works.
Okay, fantastic.
Questions, but I thought I would ask you, Rachel, how we're doing.
Well, I think we can tie it up. Vern's given us
I'm happy to stay. I don't mind staying longer if people want to, but people can feel free
great.
to go.
Well, then we'll send you some more. People can tag off, and we have had some questions about the great books specifically for organic growers, and that's something I think I'll follow up with you by email.
Well,
Vern,
Andrew Medford wrote a really good book about greenhouse tunnel growing. He's the editor of Growing for Market. Definitely recommend that one.
And we see that Alyssa Belcher suggested that. She said, I found Andrew Medford's Greenhouse and Hoop House Growers Handbook.
And then there's the really old school ones. There's Growing Greenhouse Tomatoes, Cucumbers, Lettuce. That was out of Michigan State in the 70s. Conventional growing, but in the ground, kind of interesting. And that got me onto the saturated media testing. They were doing that then. And then there's, I think it's AJ Papadopoulos out of the Ontario Station, maybe in the 70s, 80s, has a long paper on greenhouse growing, a lot of the physiology and stuff. Pretty interesting reading.
Fantastic. And April has asked, I saw April's question earlier on. This one's about what factors play into tomato flavor. And her previous question was relating to any relationship between tomato nutrients and soil nutrients. Has there been any studies on that?
Great question. Obviously the place I start is cultivar, and that's why a lot of people did graft. We had for a long time, Buffalo was the variety here. It was the right size. It had good flavor, but it had a weak root system, and that got people onto the grafting. And of course the varieties come and go. That's not available anymore. But that's how a lot of people are managing flavors, trying to pick the varieties. And of course it's conflated with disease resistance and yield and all that. Then there's a lot of talk about the watering too, how trying to kind of get, hear people say, run things dry, get higher soluble solids, get better flavor. I wish I knew more about it. I don't really know. And this whole thing of soil quality and flavor is pretty mysterious to me. I'll just say that certainly see some evidence of it, especially like in strawberries growing in different places. It's jumped out at me more. Tomatoes, I'm not so sure. And I'm also not so sure what you can do about it, because my gut feeling is it's more than just nutrients, that it's a complex set of factors that are having these effects. And the short answer is I just don't know.
And then a question, you mentioned grafting. Any comments on tomato grafting on eggplant roots?
No. Just don't know.
Okay. And any experience with tensiometers with managing watering?
Good question. Again, in the literature, when you read about monitoring, you see tensiometers, you see the blocks. Most growers have found them kind of a pain to work with, just keeping them, maintaining them, dealing with the different ways they work in different soils, texture. I think the way people are going now is there's, the monitors, the remote monitors that you can buy are coming down in price, increasing in sophistication, and that's the way it's going. Some people are starting to use those. One challenge is you can't just have a couple of them and get a good sense of what's going on. You need them throughout your house and at different depths, and then being able to relate that to how much water you're putting out. One place to start is actually calculate how many drip lines do I have? What is the output per emitter or linear foot? I mean, most people actually have no idea how much water they're putting out, and to start to get to that sense and being able to connect it to something, stage of plant, length of day, time of year. So I'm afraid we're kind of still like, in a medieval approach to people stick their hand in this soil and see what it feels like and whether they need to irrigate. That's like a lot of people, that's where a lot of people are at. And then they kind of get a sense of, okay, in my soils, when plants are this hot, I need to run this system for a half an hour twice a day. And that works. And then they just do that unless it starts to get cloudy and rainy, and they dial it back. But this is an area for information growth for sure, because most people are pretty much winging it.
Yeah, Andrew's also an irrigation designer, and we've been doing a lot of work around irrigation in the Kootenays, and similar kind of conclusions, and a lot of learning and applied applications of what we know to be done for sure. So it sounds like similar irrigation challenges from west to east, and a lot of opportunities there as well.
I mean, I think we have the technology in place now to actually do a better job. It's just figuring out the configurations and then you get into the Wi-Fi connections on farms too. That's a whole other thing of how are the signals sent and collected. And but there was some work done by one of our ag engineers and Rachel Chapman in UMaine is doing a bunch of work in this area. And one thing we found, that this one grower was really over irrigating his tunnel and under irrigating his field. When you look at just the, when you reach saturation or not, and how to meet the plant water demand at a certain stage of growth. So that was a little bit disconcerting. That, it's pretty opaque what's going on underground.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from Matt Carr of Linden Lane Farms, and I'm not even sure what he means, but do you like using heating tube lower in the crop, or do you typically circulation systems adequate?
I think he's talking about some of the bigger growers, especially I've seen this up in Quebec. There are tubes that have hot air or hot water going through them. They're actually raised and lowered raised up in the crop as it grows to provide heat and control humidity. And we don't, we have one big grower with like an 1.5 acre glass house, Dutch house, that's got that kind of technology, and also has the rails, like they have heating rails, and then the harvest carts ride on them, and it's really cool stuff. But most of our growers are, double poly, high tunnel houses, 20 to 30 feet wide, 100 feet long. It's not that complicated. But we do have people with, there's the other tubes, just those big plastic, round, whatever, 3 feet round tubes with holes punched in them. So people are using that for heat distribution in the cold season. And sometimes they often run overhead. So if you have a hot air furnace, that's a way to distribute it. So it isn't all coming out at one end and going through. And I have seen growers run that along the ground early in the season when the plants are short. Again, because heat rises, kind of makes sense. Put the heat down there where the plants are. So I don't know maybe that's the kind of tube he was asking about. And that is, not uncommon here, but a lot of people though, it's just, if it's a hot air blower, it's just up there and then the HAF fans take the stuff and move it around. When it's lower, you do need something to deflect it from those plants nearby, or you can cook them and it's too warm there and not warm at the end. And that's when the tubes help distribute.
Okay, thank you. The last comment is just thank you for sharing your bountiful knowledge. That comes in from Sharon Melnichuk. And there's been a lot of thank yous as people have had to leave because we're going on 2 hours and 15 minutes. So we still have 28 people on the call though, which speaks to the bounty of knowledge you've been sharing and
or maybe
the seemingly endless pot of topics we could touch on.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I love meeting growers from other places, and it's so cool that we all have such shared challenges, and the more we can connect our communities, the better. So as I mentioned, feel free to check out the website I have, check out our organization, come to our meetings. I will send you the link, Rachel, with the pictures of these slides, and happy to take questions by email from growers in the future.
Okay, that sounds great. And we'll put this recording and all those resources in one spot on our website, and so that our growers know how to find you as well, and vice versa. So it was really nice making this connection today. And it speaks to some of the valuable things we've come out of the pandemic years, that we've all gained a little more confidence in technology. And, only 3 years ago, I would have been asking you to fly out here through multiple blizzards and slippery roads to do an in-person event in only one town. And so here we are, light years ahead.
The upside of that would have been I could visit my son who's in school in UBC in Vancouver. The downside is now I can shut this off and go take my dog for a walk instead of spending a day in the airport. So.
Okay, well, pluses and minuses all around. But if you're out here visiting your son, we'll definitely have you in person.
Great. And if you're over this way, give me a shout. We'll take you around.
Sounds great.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vern.
Bye.